This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. Do you want to know the quickest way to start a fight in a bar in West Africa? It's very simple. All you have to do is ask for the table's opinion on the CFA, and then sit back and watch the sparks fly. You see, the CFA, for those who haven't come across it before, is a currency known as the Central African franc. And to be even more precise, it's actually two currencies, with the CFA representing both the West African franc and the Central African franc. And it's a currency used by 14 nations, including Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin, and Niger, who use the West African franc, and Chad, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and the Republic of Congo, who use the Central African franc. And whilst these 14 nations are all incredibly different from one another, the currency remains the same, with both the West African franc and the Central African franc controlled and held by France, but are solely used by these African states. It's a currency that was forced upon most of these countries in 1945, as colonialism began to fracture and many policymakers in Paris could see the writing on the wall, who sought to get ahead of it and put this in place before the cause for independence started. Now, the detractors to this currency will point out that the French forced this upon these countries at gunpoint, and also quickly remind you that when the Republic of Guinea pushed back against this French move, hoping to use their own currency and the economic levers that come with it, France responded by making an example of them, flooding the Guinea capital, Conakry, with piles of their counterfeit cash, whilst simultaneously tearing up all of the country's energy contracts they held with France, almost immediately kicking off a downward economic spiral. And to the neighbouring African states, they read the message loud and clear. The flags may no longer be a tricolour of blue, white and red, but France is certainly still in the region. The concept behind this currency policy is that the central bank in Paris will hold on to 50% of these countries' money, with another 20% held in French bank for liabilities. This is the wealth of these African states, but instead of sitting in their country, it's sitting in French vaults, where the French can regularly invest it and make money off it, and has no obligation to tell these African states what they do with their money. And to add insult to injury, these African states can only borrow the money by requesting it from France. The currency, though, is pegged to the euro at a rate of €1 to 655 Central and Western African francs, which also means that any market moves inside the EU will directly affect their currency. If the EU takes a dive, well, so does the CFA. And if the euro becomes strong, well, their manufacturing becomes less competitive. Now, heading back to our bar fight, the group that are disgusted by this will tell you that this is pure neocolonialism, and that these states only being able to access just 30% of their money prevents them from being able to roll out large-scale projects throughout their countries that could transform the way their people live. That France should not be able to decide when or how these African states access their money. To add insult to injury, with the currency being pegged to the euro, it means they have no option to do things like deflate their currency to increase local manufacturing jobs, further hurting these already fragile economies. And personally, I would agree with everything that side just said. But then the other side of this bar fight would chime in, that whilst yes, it does look bad in optics, it has been actually quite beneficial to these African states. It gives them stability and prevents their central banks being raided in a coup or a war. It prevents any new leader from spending their entire country's wealth in a short space of time. It makes trade between these 14 states even easier, as the currency is completely exchangeable. And with its wide use, outside states are actually more likely to buy it as well. But most of all, proponents for it will argue that it prevents inflation, and that while states like Ghana, who use their own currency, the Ghanaian cedi, are currently experiencing devastating rates of inflation of around 41%. Their three central franc-using neighbours have inflation rates of 6.9 in Togo, 5.2 in Côte d'Ivoire, and just 0.2 in Burkina Faso. And this dichotomy between what feels right and what is done in policy terms goes way beyond just currency, as many of these same nations have for decades watched French soldiers gad about their countries with impunity, committing crimes in the name of combating terror, and quite rightly seek to change their situation and pursue a future where they take their own country's destiny into their hands. But how is France responding to all this? We know Macron has been making frequent trips across the continent, trying to re-win favour with some of these countries, whilst also simultaneously doling out most of the French cash usually designated for Francophone Africa, and instead giving it to other non-French speaking African countries like Nigeria, Mozambique, and Angola. France is actually appearing to be pulling back of some of these countries while investing in brand new ones. So what does this all mean? Has France given up on being a neo-colonial power in Africa, or is this just a larger play by Paris? Will these moves precipitate a regional power vacuum, or are states like the UK, the US, Russia and China already beginning to make moves into the old French positions? Is this the death of Françafrique, or is it the birth of a self-ruled West Africa? Or is it just the beginning of a new scramble for control of the continent by outside powers, only looking out for themselves? Those are the questions we'll be looking to answer here today, and to help us understand how we got to this situation in the first place, and why decisions here in West Africa greatly matter to global geopolitics, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A frank discussion.
Françafrique is still relevant, but it's adopted a different framework. In the past, it was mostly political, economic, military, and both France and also African leaders could benefit from the relationship of Françafrique. France is still present in the whole of Africa, but since the crisis in Côte d'Ivoire in 2004, it's decided it didn't want to be in Africa alone anymore.
Catherine Jagou is an associate professor in international relations at the University of Nottingham and was previously the Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute. In addition to that, she's also the author of Why Europe Intervenes in Africa, Security, Prestige and the Legacy of Colonialism, as well as the book European Foreign and Security Policy, and we're thrilled to have her on the program today.
The big change for France was in 2004 in Côte d'Ivoire, not in Rwanda in 1994. France decided this can no longer go on. We can't do this alone. We need to have the US on board. We need to have the UK on board. We need to have the EU on board so that it's not the only one responsible in Africa.
France at one point had a huge African empire, spanning from the north coast of Algeria, out eastward toward modern-day Chad, and down toward the Republic of Congo and even Madagascar, as well as island possessions throughout the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. These days, though, there's far less of a French military presence on the continent, with only around 2,500 troops in the Sahel across countries like Niger and Chad, just under 1,500 troops in Djibouti, 900 in Côte d'Ivoire, 300 in Senegal on the west coast of Africa, and just 350 in Gabon in Central Africa, meaning that with these redeployments, France now has less troops in Central Africa than it does in French Guyana. Now, we'll be going into more detail about military deployments with our next guest, but what do you think the overall aim of these French military deployments in Africa actually are?
In terms of military, the military has been reduced over time. Today, it's approximately 6,000 troops, but now the military wants to deal only with migration and terrorism, because it's no longer to keep people in power or not, but it's more, we just want to stop migration and terrorism. But of course, that is not always wanted by some African leaders.
So a lot of people will point to colonial sentiments or even racist sentiments when it comes to French policy here in Africa. But what lens do you think France views its relationship with the African continent?
Well, of course, it's still linked with colonialism. France is aware that Africa matters for France and for Europe. And in the long term, we mustn't forget that actually Africa is going to be half of the world population. So by 2100, half of 8 billion, 10 billion people will be Africans. So France is aware of the importance of Africa, and it has to deal with Africa in the long term. Since the early 1990s, it intervened militarily in over 25 states. So it's really got this presence. And what's interesting is that until Rwanda, it was also completely obsessed with the Anglo-Saxon world in Africa. France wanted to stay present in Africa, but now it's saying, no, we don't want that anymore.
And this is a trend we've been seeing developing for a while now, as France's strategy towards the region is undergoing a pretty big transformation. Even as recently as 2013, France would launch operations like Sangaris in the Central African Republic, combating the Seleka and anti-Balaka forces alone. It was French forces operating in former French colonies against terrorists to keep a French-friendly government in play. But these operations proved to be difficult, and the French would pull out of the Central African Republic in 2016, handing over operations and the security direction of the country to the Russian Wagner forces, who have effectively been running the CAR since then. Later operations like Operation Saval, mostly focused on fighting Sahel terrorism against groups like Boko Haram, and Barkhane, mostly focused on terrorist groups like AQIM and IS, would see France instead acting as the head of a coalition of nations, alongside partners like Belgium, the UK, the US, Canada, Sweden, Poland, Germany, the UAE, Spain, Estonia, Czechia, the Netherlands, Denmark, and even Australia, whilst also enjoying support from regional states like Mali, Chad, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Togo, Mauritania, and Niger. France's strategy for a while seemed to be moving from being the lone sheriff in Africa to instead becoming the senior cop on the force. But all of this still costs French lives and a lot of French money. So why would France be putting so much effort into maintaining the stability and interests of North Africa if it were, as many people claim, just about migration? Surely if it were just about migration, they'd be focusing on states like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, rather than states much further from the French border, like Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger.
It's in French economic interest. You want to get resources, so you're going to go and have relations with the states which have those resources. What's quite interesting is that in the past, when France intervened militarily in Africa, it did so for this economic interest. Of course, it made sure its economic interests were protected, but more recently, it didn't go in militarily for economic interests. It went in for prestige or for security reasons or for better the devil you know than the devil you don't know, so you didn't want an opposition you didn't know in power. The exception perhaps would be Niger. That's for economic sources because of uranium. That's very important to France. In general, France is going to look at the African continent, as China does or the US does, less about colonialism because it wants those resources.
This need for resources does echo some of these same vibes as colonialism, but today the French would probably prefer creating a stable environment for French companies to work within nations like Niger rather than just extracting the minerals from themselves, as that would be widely frowned upon. But these resources that are so important to France, what sort of resources are we talking about here? What are the big draws here in the north and west of Africa?
The resources we were talking about in general for Africa would be oil, uranium, different agricultural products, and all the natural resources which are important to France. Now, what's quite interesting here is that if you're looking at trade, France has actually evolved in its legal route to make sure that companies don't have bad relations with other companies in Africa and in other states in the world. So it's quite interesting that, for example, in 2017, France has now a duty of vigilance law. So France is telling its own companies that they need to have a duty of vigilance. So it's certain companies with a certain threshold, but they have to make sure that they're not having damaging relations with other companies in Africa. That's not compulsory, but it's basically asking companies to make sure they respect social and environmental issues. So, of course, you have exploitation of resources, but the French legal system is coming into place to make sure they have proper relations. And in addition to that, there's also movement at the European Union level. There's a directive which is currently being discussed at the European Union since 2022. It's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and that's basically trying to mirror what France or Germany are currently doing and make sure that companies which are on European soil actually make sure they have due diligence in their supply chains. Yes, of course, there is exploitation, but I think that it's really important we're looking at trade.
The French aren't the only country intervening here in Africa though, with the US as an example having bases in Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Djibouti, Kenya, Niger, which is a large drone base, the Seychelles and Tunisia, and other countries like Canada, the UK, China, Italy, Japan, Russia, Turkey and the UAE also all have military bases here in mainland Africa. So how does the French military strategy and their conduct of operations here in the region compare to how the US or UK run operations? And how do these militaries, who are often friendly militaries, operate alongside one another?
There was a lot to learn from WikiLeaks actually about that. So secret services of France, they are present on the African continent. And before Rwanda, before Côte d'Ivoire, again, really no interactions with the US services or the British. But since 2005, there's much more cooperation between France and the US and the UK. And it's very interesting when you read local newspapers. It's very interesting to see that actually France is desperate to have these links with others and for the French secret services to have strong links with the US. So they are definitely working together now. The US wants to be able to rely on France basically because France has the past, the expertise, the presence and the resources.
The big story coming out of the region recently is the French withdrawal of forces from Mali after the country experienced a coup in 2021, where Malian army officer Assimi Goïta came into power. Since his ascension, he's been riling up anti-French sentiment throughout the country and blaming many of the country's problems on the colonial policies of the French. And so, under pressure, the French have withdrawn much of their force from Mali, converting many of its military bases into joint military bases with the Malian government and converting the remainders to French military academies. And much like the French exit from the Central African Republic in 2016, the Russian Wagner forces have now been invited into the country to act as the primary foreign security guarantors. First the CAR, now Mali. Do you see this as the beginning of a more regional trend where French military forces are being pushed out in favour of other security guarantors?
France has got very strong relations, for example, with Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Djibouti, and I don't think that's likely to change, at least for the moment. I don't think there'll be much change in terms of presence. Some leaders want France to be present. Other states, such as Mali, Burkina Faso, France is out. And I think it's very difficult for France to go back in. We've seen a transition to authoritarianism even more. We see those states having a rapprochement with Russia, with the Wagner group. And, well, there I don't think France can do anything. It's going to leave and not be present. Now, the problem for those states is that we see leaders of those states being against France. We can see also people demonstrating in the streets against France. But we can also read about NGOs and civil society which are very concerned because they are being basically not allowed to receive any funding anymore from France. And those voices, of course, we can't hear because we are in authoritarian regimes. What we can also see is that France didn't manage in Mali to stop terrorism. And of course, people were rightly unhappy about that failure. So there's a justified angriness against France of not being able to deal with terrorism. And the problem is that now France is out and Wagner won't or aren't able either to deal with terrorism. And the UN recently has even said that Wagner are responsible for killing 500 people in northern Mali. And so that was a report last month. So France is leaving in some states, but the problem is what is it being replaced by?
So the French have taken on one set of tactics for fighting terrorism in Mali, and Wagner have taken on a completely different set of tactics for fighting terrorism in Mali. But both have been widely unsuccessful in clamping down on these groups. Why do you think that is?
Both are unsuccessful because military intervention is only ad hoc. You can't change a society just by having a military intervention. So whether it's France or Wagner groups, military is insufficient. What you would need is basically a huge Marshall Plan, which has never happened for any African state. And of course, you would have to have economic development, you would have to have legal systems so that a whole society can function. A military intervention is never enough, basically. In the past, French interventions have been hugely problematic. More recently, of course, there's been more respect for international law. France has acted with regional organizations, with African regional organizations, with the UN. Since 2004 onwards, definitely we have a legal framework for intervention. And of course, that's a huge difference today with Wagner, because Wagner is a militia group. So by definition, do not respect international law. So that today is hugely problematic for people under regimes where you have militia groups in power and not military or military respecting international law.
Now, Wagner hasn't solved the terrorism problem in Mali, and reports have even come out that they've used some pretty shocking violence in northern parts of the country. So how is the general public reacting to Wagner, and is it making people rethink their opposition to the French forces operating within the country?
Today in Mali, people are angry about France, and they seem to be less angry about Wagner militia groups. Now, we have to be very careful with what we read, because the problem is who has a voice. if you are in an authoritarian regime, you can criticize France because that's the official regime's position. But it's going to be much harder to criticize an ally of your own regime. So we see demonstrations, they are visual against French troops in Mali, that's for sure. But the problem is that we don't know if there's also just happiness about Wagner, because those who are unhappy about Wagner can't say anything. NGOs and civil society, which no longer receive funding, are unlikely to be happy about that, but of course they can't say anything. So I think we have to be very careful with what we read. And we can't read when people are unhappy and the regime is allied with a militia group. I suppose when we're talking about gaining hearts and minds of people, if Wagner is not doing that, well, then people will still say, well, what have we got to gain about this? But the problem is that if the leaders in Mali have those strong relations with Wagner, there's actually very little that the local people can do. France cares and France will try and keep relations, but I think it is much more difficult now, so they might do it via NGOs. Even the radio stations, the journalists, the whole society has been clamped down onto, so there is no more freedom of expression. If you clamp down on freedom on journalists, it's going to be much harder for France to keep relations, so it can have links through other countries, other EU countries, through the US. But if a state is closing down on itself, it's much harder. You can have access to intelligence in the north, in the desert, you can use satellites, so you do have access to that. You can see what's happening in general. But what you do really need is access to local populations. Yes, secret services likely will have access to that, but it doesn't really help for society in general because it is in an authoritarian structure.
Well, if there's already a non-friendly government sitting in Bamako, what interest do countries like France or Germany have in becoming further involved in Malian politics?
So France and Germany didn't really have a huge economic interest in Mali. Now, I think it's really difficult to encourage that trade and investment because companies don't really want to go into an authoritarian regime. So yes, France, Germany could use the EU to say we are the EU, we are not France, but even then it's up to the companies to go in or not. So I'm not sure to what extent France or Germany could have that power as governments to encourage their companies to go into an authoritarian state.
So what about the initial stated interest in Mali, which was combating terrorism? Is this still a primary goal of France and Germany, and what options do they actually have in front of them at the moment?
The issue of terrorism is very worrying. It might go on to the Ivory Coast, might go on to Senegal, and if the leaders remain in place, then France will still be present there. But of course, if leaderships change and they say they don't want France anymore, I think France would leave. So what it's trying to do is to make sure that terrorists do not go into states. So I think in the next 5 years, France and French role will be to try and contain the spread of terrorism and also encourage economic development. But as we said earlier on, I think that's really difficult. It's also really difficult for the European Union to do that, especially in the Sahel and West Africa, because the European Union has this idea of investment in Africa with the Global Investment Initiative. But the problem with that is that it's also extremely focused on African states containing terrorism and migration. So it's very double-edged sword for the European Union, for France and for the European Union to say we want to promote economic development, but really what we're really concerned with is that economic development would then stop migration into Europe. And we're going to use that development aid or that development cooperation to stop that migration. So in the next 5 years, France, I think, will still be present, wherever it can still remain present, and it will try and contain terrorism. But really, it should be looking into giving more investments, giving more economic development, but it's doing that in a very odd way because it's saying dependent on stopping migration.
France seems very aware of the shaky ground beneath their feet, knowing that they need to make concessions in Africa and possibly even cede their privileged colonial dividends, whilst politically realizing that any ground given to Africa is widely unpopular with the French electorate, as shown by Macron's pseudo-apology towards the Algerians, and that the optically right thing to do, pulling French forces out, may mean handing over the reins to Russia and the Wagner Group, who not only have a somewhat unglamorous track record in places like Mozambique, where they've gone in, made things worse, and then handed it back to the government forces, but also take direct orders from Moscow, and in such could theoretically have the power to direct migration flows, bolster friendly anti-French terrorists, and supplant local French intel assets, all of which, as we witness in the Central African Republic, can be done within a short space of time. So, will the French forces turn toward the US to secure their southern flanks, or will the French military just base themselves from other countries within the area and use the cloak of multilateralism, private business, to instead reshape their position on the ground? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Extortion and Energy.
One of the most salient examples of that is Algeria, given the fact that it's a former colony, but also the fact it's a very significant oil producer in terms of OPEC. They have a capacity of an upwards of 1 million barrels a day, in addition to being a very prolific gas exporter to Europe, although that is increasingly going towards Italy.
Colby Connolly is a senior research analyst at Energy Intelligence, as well as a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Colby's primary focus is on energy research, including the energy transition, corporate strategy, and competitor intelligence in the oil and gas markets, as well as macroeconomics, operating conditions, and political trends within his specialty areas of the Middle East and North Africa. Prior to joining Energy Intelligence, Colby also worked as a research associate at the Arab Gulf States Institute, and spent several years working as a contractor in Saudi Arabia in support of workforce nationalization projects, and has become one of the most respected analysts when it comes to the oil and gas industry in the Middle East and North Africa. And we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
Total Energies, the French oil company, is a significant operator there. And Algeria has enormous gas reserves. It has, I think the last number I looked at was around 4.5 trillion cubic meters. Being on Europe's doorstep, it's really critical for gas. The Mediterranean oil market has a low production cost and a fairly high risk tolerance. So Libya and Algeria are really the two countries with the largest oil and gas reserves in North Africa. And like I mentioned, Total is present in both.
The French energy company Total, or Total Energies, is an absolutely huge company. In fact, it's the third biggest company in all of France, with the energy giant being founded back in 1924 by a French colonel with the backing of 90 international banks, and being birthed into existence at the behest of then French President Raymond de Poincaré, and ever since that founding in the 1920s, has enjoyed a close relationship with the French state. Whilst the company is nominally a private company, no different to any others, it does enjoy certain benefits and perks given to it by the French state. But 1924 was a long time ago, so do you think there's still that connection there between Total Energies and the government in Paris when it comes to things like where they operate, who will help defend their assets, and which commodities to prioritize?
It would be foolish to think that they're, of course, not talking to each other, which is not totally unusual. But what their policy is, Total has a pretty distinct set of interests. I doubt that they're going to march into places at the direction of Paris if the terms aren't right. And they've displayed that elsewhere in particularly high-risk jurisdictions. In this industry, the commercial terms are so important to trying to ensure an actual return on these investments. And that's not something that governments are generally the best at figuring out.
Whilst the French once enjoyed near exclusive contracts in many of these colonial holdings, these days these nations are nominally free to do business with anyone they choose. And French companies like Total are now directly competing against a lot of countries from the Netherlands, the US, and even China these days, all of which have rapidly muscled their way into the commodity markets here in the north of Africa. So can you take us through how the energy landscape is changing in these recent years, with France no longer having complete control over who gets what?
Bringing up the Chinese firms is interesting because they have invested in Algeria quite a bit more than they really had in the past. We're talking about North Africa, but actually Iraq is another very solid example of that. Chinese companies are much more prolific in the Iraqi upstream than they used to be.
Well, Algeria and Iraq aren't particularly stable states, so why do companies like Total or Sinopec from China chase deals in countries like this? Why is their risk threshold much higher?
In terms of why they have such a high risk tolerance, I think it's a case of a lot of the countries they operate in having had some real problems attracting more investors in recent years. Algeria is a very good example of that. That's why they rewrote their oil law. there may be a mentality there that if you're more willing to invest in some of these higher risk areas, that you may be able to squeeze better terms, which are usually set by host governments. And that could be kind of where the role of Paris comes in as well. So there may be a bit of that mentality to Total's strategy there. But they're present really across most of the Mideast. So North Africa is not the most unique thing in the world, the most unique place in the world for them to be present. They're a huge partner for ADNOC, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, in the UAE.
So I keep reading from certain publications that Algeria is fast becoming the crown jewel of Françafrique, and that Algeria and its massive oil and gas reserves will soon become one of Paris's main objectives and key points in the region. But when we look at the African nations where France invests most of its money, Algeria isn't even in the top 5. The top 5 being Morocco, Nigeria, Angola, the Republic of Congo, South Africa, and then Algeria. So in your opinion, is Algeria set to be the engine for France, or right now are they just a conveniently placed temporary supply hub?
I feel like a lot of the time what happens is people will either look at production numbers on paper or reserves on paper and see, oh, this country is a gigantic producer, so that's someone we can diversify to, or another potential supplier. And it's not totally incorrect. It's just overly reductive. Consumptions, for example, Algeria sells natural gas domestically at a subsidized rate, and their domestic consumption and demand have really risen over the last several years. It was 2021 that consumption hit around 51% of production, and that is really a problem. It's a real constraint on exports. Algeria is also very susceptible to fluctuations in its gas supply based on what it has to do in terms of its OPEC quota. They use a lot of gas that gets produced to re-inject it into oil wells for enhanced oil recovery techniques. So when there's a cut, as there is now, they can actually raise gas production because they don't have to do as much re-injection. That puts Algeria really kind of at the mercy of a couple different things, which is their domestic consumption, their OPEC quota. There have been a lot of new agreements signed for more gas supply to Europe, talk of new pipelines, one going through Sardinia. But this is a place where things don't really happen quickly, and where the decision-making process in Algiers is pretty opaque. So yes, they're offering better terms for some of the firms to go in there, and they've had some success with that, although it's mostly been firms like Total, Occidental, and Eni that are already present there. I hate the term synergies, but there are obvious synergies there, with security cooperation. But that's something that they've probably become fairly adept at. They certainly are pretty adept at maintaining a lot of these relationships with different parties around the world.
So when Total is operating across Francophone Africa, they've usually enjoyed the knowledge that if a situation in the country were to get out of hand or terrorism were to bubble away, that Paris would deploy its armed forces to fight battles in the country that would help Total to continue its production, or even evacuate Total's staff if the situation got out of control. Now though, with the French being kicked out of the Central African Republic, Mali, and by the looks of it now Burkina Faso, these countries will now no longer have that guarantee of French support, and instead will be largely reliant on the Russian Wagner Group for its state security response. So how do companies like Total feel about this new arrangement, and do they have a preference for the international law-bound French forces, or the untethered Wagner operatives?
It depends how effective either party would have been at bringing stability. That's usually what a lot of firms will look for when they're trying to go in somewhere. If they're going to plow a bunch of money into a project, I don't think there are always as many concerns about who's doing it. But if you're going to bring a group like Wagner into the picture, that could certainly change the outlook, just because obviously for Western firms, anything Russian has become really toxic. You saw that with how quickly a lot of international oil companies pulled out of Russia. So anything that promotes stability is what these firms tend to prefer. There are a lot of investors that are more conscious of these things nowadays. If it's a company that's at least partially publicly traded and it becomes very public that Wagner Group is protecting your assets or something like that, I wouldn't imagine that would go over extremely well. And that could involve sanctions exposure too at some point. I mean, depending on exactly what the relationship is. That's been a consistent issue in Libya with a lot of the shut-ins that they've had. Historically speaking, I think if you look at when the world or key regions in the world during periods of more intense multipolarity, it almost always seems more dangerous. So that's something that a lot of firms really have to consider very carefully operating in some of these jurisdictions, especially as the political landscape on the ground can change so much.
So as part of your work, you often do risk mitigation strategies for mining companies looking to invest into this region of the world. And I'm sure a few of them at least have come to you asking for what is the best strategy for operating in these regions where French defense can no longer be guaranteed. So if a mining company operating in somewhere like Mali had the choice of hiring someone like Wagner to just set up a 5k radius of solid defense around the mine site, is that an option these mining companies may approach? Or should these companies be prepared that they're going to have to try and do nation building and investment throughout the entire country to lower tensions and provide a secure location for mining and resources?
The second route definitely makes more sense because, for example, let's say you have a gas field that feeds to an LNG plant in country X. You can keep the producing asset, you can keep the field safe, you can keep your midstream infrastructure, the pipelines, processing, whatever else, safe. You can secure every part of that value chain theoretically, but you still have to deal with your host government. You still have to deal with regulators and everything like that. So if everything else goes to hell, a lot of key parts of state services or whatever it may be that you need to operate could also really make that environment much more difficult to function in. Most firms would be fairly cognizant of that, at least from the energy perspective. Of course, there are countries where production has been able to continue and exports can continue while there's civil conflict, and that's happened in Libya for over a decade. But at the same time, there hasn't been an extraordinary amount of new investment there, which is needed. So the pros of keeping your assets protected and kind of letting everything else fall apart are that you could conceivably continue to operate that way. When we try and score countries on a risk basis, things like, government cohesion, how well do different departments work together, political volatility, is there an election every 5 minutes, independence of the judiciary, for one, how lucrative the production is, right? Then the desire to stay there will be that much higher. But you have Total remaining in Yemen. They're one of the last majors that's there. They're one of the last international energy that's there. So many others have pulled out, even those that also, historically have a high risk tolerance. If you can't count on consistency in things like export policy, tax policy, contract enforcement, things like that, then letting the whole country burn just so you can continue pumping things out of the ground isn't always going to be your best option.
With France seeing more and more African states take up anti-French policies, French oil and mining companies are likely to face the reality of more countries with a destabilized security situation. And with these countries increasingly putting their investments towards countries like South Africa and Angola, countries that have less risk profile for a French company, do you think we may see this as a growing trend where French companies put less effort into Francophone African states and prioritize countries that are simply easier or more profitable? If this trend does start to kick off and French companies pull out of investments like Algeria, are we likely to see Chinese or Russian-backed oil companies move into that vacuum?
Very possible. I don't think the outlook for them leaving a place like Algeria is something that's going to happen anytime soon. But if they do divest from certain assets or pull out of projects, for example, Total did pull out of a pretty substantial petrochemicals project that was a joint venture with Sonatrach, the Algerian national oil company. You may see Chinese or Russian firms come in to replace them, but the Chinese or Russian firms also aren't just going to accept terrible terms forever just because the Westerners left and because there's easier access now. Initially, if there's a population that's particularly eager to welcome non-Western investors, resources are kind of viewed by the Chinese or Russian firms as a way to make money hand over fist, and the population doesn't perceive that they're really reaping the rewards of that, then there's no reason to think otherwise. I'd be very cautious in saying that I think these groups are trying to necessarily push out Western firms in favor of others, but they really don't make life easier.
Do you think we're seeing the end of an era where French energy companies take primary positions in French-speaking states like Algeria or Niger, or UK companies take primary positions in English-speaking countries like Nigeria or South Africa? That these countries' colonial pasts no longer determine their future economic partnerships?
I don't think their investment pattern would suggest a close alignment with that kind of older order of politics. Granted, they're an oil company, so I don't think politics will go before money for them, but the places that you do see them concentrating on Namibia is a good example. That's quite a possibility. And the outlook from the energy perspective is that you have so many more firms chasing what we call advantage barrels. And that's usually a resource base that has a low production cost as well as a low carbon intensity. And those kinds of things aren't distributed based on where your former colonies were, or where your political loyalties lie. And it's a different kind of industry in that regard than it used to be. So for a company like that, their interests may diverge from their host government or their home government. And I think, if anything, that would signal probably more of a decoupling from political interests, only because this is, again, I mean, I mentioned shareholders before. This is something that concerns them, because that's where the market is going in the future, regardless of where French foreign policy is. I know that the Algerians, with some other producing countries, have been really frustrated with Europe, in the sense that it's kind of the same thing that's frustrated the US industry, which is that they feel like that they're being told to produce more now in order to produce less later. And if you're going to invest in increasing your production, you can't do that with just a 5-year window. It's done with like a 25 or 30-year window. So if you're a European buyer telling a North African country, okay, I want more gas for 5 years, but then, we really want to wean ourselves off of it after that, they're not really going to be as interested in signing those kinds of deals. You need a lot more of a runway to make sure that you actually get returns on your investment in that regard. But, as a lot of that new supply comes online, Qatar is just such a heavyweight in terms of gas that will really impact the ability of North African producers to kind of get the same terms that they want from Europeans.
So where does the future of France's energy interests lie? Is it still with the Francophone African countries, or frankly, is it slowly moving on to other places?
When you're looking at North Africa, Italy actually comes up a lot more these days. And that could be a function of the fact that ENI has just been quite a lot more active. They had that Mate plan, which was just trying to push a lot more engagement with North Africa in terms of investing in production and things like that. So in that regard, we're still talking about a European country, but sort of a shift away from where the political influence may have been in the past. That could be part of what you're seeing. But I think it's to a point where you really have to think about these other multipolar major powers like China or Russia coming in, because in terms of that advantage barrel picture that I mentioned before, Algeria really doesn't come to the top of the list, right? So it's, yes, they have the resources, but it's as much a question of them having the resources as these countries being able to keep themselves attractive as an investment destination, when we're looking at a world that is telling itself that it wants to use less oil and gas, regardless of how slowly or quickly that may happen. You'll see investment shifting probably more to places like the Gulf and the Mideast, or US Gulf of Mexico has that kind of an advantage. It's not necessarily just who the players influencing the country will be, as much as their ability to influence the investment environment themselves.
So Paris is now watching long-term military deployments being pushed down by dictatorships looking to use Paris as the villain for all of their nation's woes, whether that be right or wrong, in an effort to gain popularity with their countrymen. And France can do very little about it. But now even French private industry and companies like Total are beginning to feel many of these same pinches, now being forced to compete directly for influence within countries they once had an iron grip over, with countries like France, China, the UK, the US, the Gulf, and many more. The trend lines don't look good for France. So what will Paris do? Well, they have a world-class military, they have a large GDP, and they have centuries of experience and connections within the region. So will Paris attempt to reassert itself in Africa by using brute force? Will it come back to these states bearing an olive branch, hoping to build the long-talked-about relationship of equals? Or will they simply accept the current trend and leave some of their long-term strategic headaches, like the north of Mali, out for the Russians to deal with, willing to accept whatever the consequences bear from the decision? What is the future of France's North Africa policy? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. The Empire Strikes Back.
I think the biggest change that France has experienced in the last 3 years on Africa is that it's pivoting away focus from its former colony. It's moving its focus onto countries like Nigeria, like Angola, like South Africa, like Mozambique. And that's a reflection of some of the problems that the French relationship with its former colonies has experienced over the last couple of decades.
Alex Vines directs the Africa program at Chatham House and is the organization's managing director for risk, ethics, and resilience. Before this role, Alex also chaired the UN panel of experts on Côte d'Ivoire and was a member of the UN panel of experts on Liberia. In addition to that, he was also a member for the Commonwealth Observer Group to Mozambique and Ghana, and worked for UNOMOS and the UNAVIM too. He also worked at Human Rights Watch as a senior researcher on its Africa Arms and Business and Human Rights programs, and has served as a consultant for the UN Office of Drug and Crime, the JICA, the DFID, USAID, and the EU, specializing in the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS. He's written numerous expert reports for the EU Parliament and has testified to lawmakers including the US Congress and Senate, the EU Parliament, and the UK and Finnish parliaments, as well as the Angolan and Mozambican National Assemblies. And we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
France, like my own country, the United Kingdom, is dealing with the realities of losing empire, of decolonization. And Africa, for the French map of the world, has been a really important part of emphasizing that France is still a big player, particularly on the African continent. And so Africa has been a very high foreign policy priority for France in a way that I don't think you would see you don't see in any other former imperial European power. You don't see it in the United Kingdom, you don't see it in Italy or Spain or really in Portugal or Belgium. And so that remains part of France's argument that it's still an important global middle power, and it's part of its defense for having a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So the thing that France holds on to is its foreign policy focused on Africa, and that it's a nuclear power also.
So the French spent a lot of blood and treasure running operations like Operation Serval and Operation Barkhane to fight terrorism within the Sahel and West Africa. But overall, what was France hoping to gain from these operations? What were the underlying strategic goals here?
Operation Serval was encouraged by Africans. The Security Council resolution was co-authored with Nigeria and France, for example. So Serval had African backing because there was a real fear that the whole of Mali would fall under jihadist control. Barkhane, as you rightly said, became increasingly problematic and has had to be now wound down, and it no longer exists. So Mali had the Malian French military engagements over the last decade did initially have African support. But the real interest, I think, of France is next door in Niger, which has become even more strategic for France since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is that a French company, Aviva, holds significant uranium assets in Niger. And France, unlike other European powers, much of its energy supply is based on nuclear. So for keeping the lights on in France, having consistent energy, Nigerian uranium is particularly important for France. I think that explains partly why there is such continued focus on partnership and investment and defense of Niger from Paris today.
Whilst the French do operate heavily within Niger, the Americans are actually the ones that maintain the largest military base within the country, Niger being one of the primary launching facilities for American drones in the region. And this is a story seen throughout African states. Whereas public as France is, nations like the United States actually have a larger military presence on the ground. With France seeing all of this pushback against what they see as colonial oppression, do other countries like the United States, Canada, or Germany, who aren't the traditional colonial oppressors, receive the same kinds of pushback from these states?
Well, the United States lost some special forces also in Niger, and that provoked a reduction of US footprint militarily on the African continent for a while. But you're right, there is a drone base in Niger, although the focus of that drone base is less about the Sahel and it's much more about Libya and kind of the North African operational terrain. But yes, France is under pressure. I've worked in a number of Francophone African countries. I was in 20 years ago in the crisis in Côte d'Ivoire, and it was very apparent that the French were under increasing pressure to reduce their investments and presence. I found that I could drive through roadblocks by speaking poor French and having a British flag much more easily than my French counterparts, for example.
When we're discussing Francophone Africa, we usually picture states like Mali, Mauritania, or Algeria, but former French African colonies go all the way down to Gabon and the Republic of Congo. So how does French policy in the center of Africa, in states like Gabon, compare to West African states like Mali or Senegal?
The relationship now with Mali is terrible with the military junta, so there isn't much of a relationship at the moment, although Paris still thinks that at some point in the future the junta will have moved on and there will be some sort of rapprochement and French re-engagement there. The relationship with Gabon is very different. President Macron visited Gabon earlier this year on a visit, and the connections between Gabon and France remain very robust. So you're absolutely right. You do need to look at each country and its particularities. But it's certainly the case, I think, that there is a desire to diversify away from such a close relationship with France that Françafrique represented. One example of this with Gabon is that Gabon joined the Commonwealth, which is a grouping of countries that originally were British colonies, although it's much broader now. But not only did Gabon last year join the Commonwealth, but another Francophone country in West Africa, Togo, did too. And what this tells me is about diversification of relationships, basically, that are taking place. And it's an important thing to remember that this isn't just about East and West. There's also diversification of partnerships and relationships within the Western Bloc itself. And the joining of the Commonwealth by Gabon and Togo is an example of that. But I'd like to give you another example, which is that Angola, which is a Lusophone country, Portuguese speaking, has applied to join the Commonwealth and the Francophonie. They applied at the same time. So again, that's diversifying away from Portugal. So it tells you that something else is going on here within Western international networks.
Well, if France is taking a step back, then who's filling the new power vacuum in the region? Is it a regional state like Nigeria? Is it another European power like the British? Or are we seeing outside powers like Russia and China starting to play more of a role within this region?
It is about multipolarity, and absolutely Russia is looking at where it can be opportunistic. It's certainly given France a run for its money in the Central African Republic. France had been for years trying to get other countries to burden share some of its investments on security and defense there, and then was shocked when the Russians popped up with Wagner and various things. That's been something that France was ill prepared for. And of course, Wagner is also, as you've mentioned, in Mali, and it's trying to get into Burkina Faso also. And France is alarmed by this. Certainly, the Russians are looking opportunistically at where they can find entry points. The Chinese are a lot more strategic. The last FOCAC Big Africa Summit for the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation was in Dakar, and the previous special envoy for Africa from China was a Francophone speaker. So the Chinese are also seeing where they can get market entry and opportunity, and they are across the continent in West Africa, and their ambition transcends linguistic blocks. But it is interesting also that the one Chinese military facility that there is on the African continent is in Djibouti. But that joins a lot of others, including the United States and Japan and others that have facilities there too. And France has some footprint still in Djibouti.
So we've seen in both the CAR and now in Mali, where national governments have chosen to ditch the French armed forces and instead turn towards the Wagner group for their security. But how do these two organizations stack up against each other? And what can Wagner offer that the French couldn't?
The track record of Wagner is not good. I mean, they failed in Mozambique. I've even interviewed personally a Wagner operative who was involved in that. And the lesson that the Mozambicans have drawn is that private mercenary groups or kind of private, however you look at Wagner, don't work. And so what the Mozambicans have now done is brought in the Rwandan military to assist them, and also a regional force from Southern Africa called SAMIM. Wagner is operational in Mali. There's been a UN human rights report suggesting that they've been very much behind some serious human rights abuses. I'm not confident Wagner have been particularly successful or any more successful than France has. And so I think that's very problematic looking forward to the future of Mali if they're going to rely on a Russian security guarantee. Where Wagner, I think, might have done a bit better if you're looking at kind of elite protection or Praetorian Guard action is in Central African Republic. It does look as if Wagner were able to foil a coup attempt against the administration in the Central African Republic. So from that point of view, you can see that they have provided some sort of security for the incumbent regime. but it's a patchy record. What we might see is actually Africans increasingly looking at where they can have their own improved security forces, but with some funding and training. So the Rwanda model, for example, is one that looks as if it's going to be replicated in West Africa. The president of Rwanda very recently visited both the Republic of Guinea, Guinea-Conakry, and Benin to look at security agreements to provide Rwandan troops to both countries. So that's where I think some of the gap filling is coming from, actually. It's from within Africa itself.
Macron recently has been giving numerous speeches about the changing relationship between France and Africa, with the speeches proclaiming that France is seeking to build a relationship of equals, rather than the previous arrangement. But how sincere do you think Macron's proposals are, and will this trend outlive him as a president?
Macron gave a big speech just recently on the eve of his Africa trip, where he visited a number of countries, including, we mentioned already, Gabon, but he went to Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in that, he highlighted that France wouldn't be a gendarme any longer coming into Africa in the way that it was, and that the French military bases that are in Africa, in places like Côte d'Ivoire and Chad and Niger, will be transformed into being kind of cooperated with their host governments and become more like training facilities. So France is thinking about how to draw lessons from its setbacks in West Africa and kind of re-image itself. French policymakers have admitted to me that were over arrogant and complacent, and they have to become much more attuned to the desire of Africans to have their own agency and their own destiny. I think this is a journey of decolonization in terms of attitude as well as action by France that is continuing, and that Macron administration has finally understood that, although it's a bumpy road, and I think there's quite a lot of journey yet to take place.
On one hand, I've seen multiple people putting forward the argument that ending the colonial hangover of France still militarily operating within these countries with impunity is a good thing, and that it finally gives some of these West African states autonomy over their own strategic decisions. But I've also seen people, on the other hand, point to the fact that the states like the CAR, Mali, and Burkina Faso became much more unstable and dangerous after the exit of French forces. So I want to ask, where would you sit between those 2 points?
So in Mali, the Operation Saval, in response to militant groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda attempting to seize parts of the country, including Bamako, was very popular. There was plenty of popular support for that. There were masses of Malians in the streets welcoming the French when they arrived, flying French flags. The problem was that France overstayed its time in Mali and was unable to really find alternatives that could kind of backfill for the idea of a G5 Sahel is good on paper, but it didn't really provide anything in practice. France has for many, many years, many decades, tried to get other countries to be interested in the Central African Republic. The way I see it is that France's relationship with countries like the Central African Republic and Mali are not linear, but there are things about France that the elites like. They like visiting France. They follow French football and French soft power very closely. French cuisine can have an influence too. And so I think a future scenario is that France will be less neo-colonial. Even the Central and Central African francs might eventually disappear, although they are stronger in the short term, I think, because of the volatility of international finance and the hike of interest rates and the expensiveness of the dollar. So it's interesting that the Francophone African countries, which have the CFAs, are actually in better shape than their Anglophone counterparts because of the kind of backing of the French Treasury, in effect. But this is a journey which will see those sorts of arrangements gradually disappear. And in a world of multipolarity, I think what we'll see is France being a lot more visible in countries where it wasn't very active. South Africa, for example, the largest single foreign direct investment in Africa currently is the Total gas investment in northern Mozambique. That's transforming the relationship between France and Mozambique in a way that it never was previously. And so I think this is what we're going to see. A lot more mixing up of relationships and a gradual breakdown of linguistic blocks.
So you see France taking its eggs out of the Francophone baskets and instead placing them into more countries that simply make Paris more money. and for the most part are relatively more stable. The beginning of the end for the concept of Françafrique.
I think we'll see that, and other countries like Zambia and South Africa also. And yes, it'll be following the business to a degree, but also you don't have the long shadow of colonial past also complicating the relationships. And so it will, in a way, be easier for France to operate. Now, having said that, France still has another way that it looks at Africa that is unique. And certainly in the Indian Ocean, it has both the island of Mayotte and Réunion, which are départements of France. And so France still says it's a neighbor to Mozambique and to East African countries and behaves a bit differently because of those two départements that they maintain.
And the future for Françafrique, what do you see going forward?
Certainly, French planners have thought about that, but in the end, they have concluded that West Africa is so geographically close to Europe. It is European near abroad. And issues like migration and the spread of radical jihadism, but also the proximity of supply chains means that West Africa will remain important for France. What France will continue to do, given its limited availability of budget, is to see how it can mainstream its foreign policy ambitions through organizations like the European Union and have the EU and its members partly fund what are in the end French objectives. And so France remains the big power most concerned about Africa within the European Union. But what we are now seeing as a knock-on for that is that other European powers are having to up their game and their own thinking on Africa rather than just relying on a Paris perspective on African developments and peace and security and investment prospects. Well, you can see Germany really increasing its Africa capabilities in terms of think tanks, in terms of research, and also we're also seeing across Europe foreign ministries developing individual Africa strategies and plans. And so that in itself is telling you that European countries are becoming less complacent about Africa. They don't just see the African continent any longer as a continent of humanitarianism, but they see it as a strategic geography next to Europe, of which they will need future partnerships, both in terms of accessing labor, given the aging workforces across Europe, but also in terms of shortened supply chains, given the uncertainties that we already saw with COVID that are now more visible because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But most of all, crisis planning in case there is a real rupture of global supply chains if, for example, China were to decide to invade Taiwan.
I began this episode discussing the Central African franc and the slap in the face to African autonomy it stands for. And we probably could have done an entire episode on just that topic, but we have done a lot of economics topics recently, so that's a deep dive for another time. The thing is though, for these African leaders, the ones who would actually have to make that decision to keep it or ditch it, the consequences of either option are very real. As much as us here at home can do the moral or high-minded thing, actually untethering these countries' currencies would come with pretty severe risks of things like massive inflation, hard currency shortfalls. So whether you keep it or ditch it, both options aren't great. And again, why I bring this up is it's a great analogy for what's likely to happen in the region going forward. What the likely solution most people think is coming is a pretty good mirror of what France hopes to do with the region. What's happening is that 9 West African states have put forward the idea of an ECOWAS currency, ECOWAS standing for the Economic Community of West African States. The currency would be shared by Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. And whilst a West African currency being used by West Africans does sound really nice, most of this currency in actual practice would end up being administered by France. And there's talk of it still being backed by the euro to prevent some of the inflation seen throughout the region. And even if these countries look to take that plunge and untether themselves from the euro, the currency would be almost solely manipulated by Nigeria, whose nominal GDP is over double that of the other 8 states combined. They would be taking some of the reins from France and simply handing control not to their own policymakers, but instead to Nigeria, who itself has a fairly spotty track record when it comes to financial transparency. And even when it comes to the talks and process, at the moment, it's looking like it will be largely administered by the EU, probably by the largest French-speaking country in the EU, whomever that may be. so not much will change. Making a big move like an ECOWAS currency would turn these countries' financial systems on their head and bring temporary financial pain to all 9 of the nations. And in the end, they'd still likely remain largely under the influence of France via the EU. The only minor difference being they just gave Nigeria massive leverage over its neighbouring states. Hardly the cry of freedom that many of these states have been wanting for decades now. West Africa is a land of beautiful landscapes, abundant minerals, hardworking people, and endless potential. But for now, it seems trapped in place by fleeing private capital, a stubborn France, an exploitative Russia, and a growing terrorist threat looming in the distance. As I said at the start of this episode, I know a very quick way to start a fight in this bar, but I have no idea how to end one. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. It's been a while since we've done a deep dive on Africa, so this one was great, but also predictably depressing to put together. In brighter news, you might have seen that Redline just crossed the threshold for 25 million streams, and we cannot believe we got here so quickly. This show has only reached this point through people like yourself who've listened to the program and suggested it to your friends, have emailed people, have posted it on Reddit or posted on your social media, and honestly, I cannot thank each and every single one of you enough for doing so. If you told me a few years ago when we started this thing, we'd be hitting these sort of numbers, I never would have believed you. And in addition to this 25 million, we're also quickly closing in on our 100th episode. So over the next few weeks, we'll be announcing some celebrations and specials to celebrate 100 episodes of the Redline. And if you want to keep up to date with all these celebrations and everything else we have coming up, you can do so by following us on social media. We can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, TikTok, and Mastodon at the handle @TheRedlinePod. Or if you can follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show is completely funded by our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help keep myself and this team going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I want to thank Thomas Garrison, Michael Wickman, Christopher Mastriani, Vadim Kovalovsky, Devin Riley, Keenan Farmer, Thomas Mullane, and Annie Kay, who are the latest Patreons to sign up as of the time of recording. This show is only possible because of the support of listeners like this, so if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars and you like what we do here at the show, we'd greatly appreciate it. But for now, this episode on French strategic goals in North Africa is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first one, which discusses a lot of the issues around a particular French mining company that we would have loved to talk about here on the show, but were advised by our legal team not to. So if you want to know what we wanted to say, check out The Looting Machine by friend of the show, Tom Burgess, for a look at how mining in Africa really works. The second book is Africa is Not a Country by Dipo Faloyan, for an amazing look at the misconceptions outsiders often have about Africa, all strung around stories of growing up in Lagos. And our third recommendation is Africa's Last Colonial Currency by Fanny Pagood, for a look at how the CFA impacts the people of the continent. I want to give a thanks to this week's guests, Catherine Jagou, Colby Connolly, and Alex Vines. All of you were an absolute pleasure to work with on this one, and we can't wait to have you back on the show soon. I also want to give thanks to my staff, Wade McCarr, the producer, Jamie Tanu, the primary researcher on this episode, as well as our other writers, Perry Grace, Daniela Zavella, Genevieve Dolan-May, Nate Ostilla, Nick McNally, Sean Cotter-Lamb, Isaac Gibbs, Ahmad Al-Ahmad, Andrew Garbery, and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analysts, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Ross Crabtree, our media advisor, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. I'll say it once, and I'll say it again, this is the best team in the business, and we're so lucky to have them. The Redline will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.